Let's focus now on the minister's housing exclusion, one of the greatest benefits for ministers under the federal tax law. If a church properly designates a portion of a minister's cash salary for expenses of a home that the minister provides, this is commonly referred to as a housing allowance. On the other hand, when a church provides the housing for a minister, it's often called a parsonage allowance. In either instance, it provides an opportunity for a minister to exclude dollars from gross income for income tax purposes, but not for Social Security tax purposes. Let me quickly clarify two terms: the housing allowance and the housing exclusion. The allowance is an official designation made by a church or denomination in the case of retired ministers, which qualifies certain housing expenses of a minister to be excluded, the exclusion, from federal and in some cases state income taxes. So the minister's housing benefit starts with the designation of an allowance and ends with the calculation of the amount that's eligible for exclusion on the minister's federal income tax return. Let's quickly cover 6 of the key housing allowance and exclusion basics. Number 1, designating the housing allowance. Officially and prospectively are the 2 key words relating to the designation of a housing allowance. Officially, the housing designation should be stated in writing, preferably by resolution of the top governing body. Prospectively, the allowance must also be made prospectively. Any cash housing payments made before a designation of the housing allowance are fully taxable for income and Social Security tax purposes. Number 2, reporting the housing allowance to ministers. The designated housing allowance may be reflected on Form W-2 in Box 14 with the notation Housing Allowance. Though not required, this reporting method is reflected in IRS publications. Number 3, ministers living in a parsonage owned by or rented by a church. If a minister lives in church-owned housing or housing rented by the church, which is what we referred to previously as a parsonage, the fair rental value of the housing is not reported for income tax purposes. But the fair rental value is reported for self-employment tax purposes. In addition to the fair rental value of a parsonage that is excluded from income tax, the minister may also request a housing allowance to cover expenses that are incurred in maintaining the church-owned or church-rented housing. Examples of allowable items include expenses that are paid by the minister but not reimbursed, so for things like utilities, repairs, furnishings, and appliances. Remember, if the actual expenses exceed the housing allowance designated by the church, the excess amount cannot be excluded from income. Number 4, ministers owning or renting their own home. If a minister owns or rents a home, the minister may exclude for income tax purposes a cash housing allowance that is not more than reasonable pay for services and is the lowest of the amount used to provide a home from current ministerial income, the amount prospectively and officially designated, or the fair rental value of the furnished home plus utilities. Many ministers make the mistake of automatically excluding from income, for income tax purposes, the total designated housing allowance, even though the fair rental value of the furnished home or actual housing expenses are less than the designation. This may cause significant underpayment of income taxes. Let's walk through a quick example. A minister lives in a personally owned home. The church prospectively designated $28,000 of the salary as a housing allowance. The minister spends $27,000 for housing-related items, and the fair rental value of the home is $29,000, including furnishings and utilities. Since the amount spent is lower than the designated housing allowance or the fair rental value, the excludable housing allowance is $27,000. Therefore, $1,000, $28,000 less $27,000 must be added to taxable income on Form 1040. Unless the minister has opted out of Social Security, the entire $28,000 is reportable for Social Security purposes on Schedule SE. Accounting for the housing allowance. The determination of the fair rental value of church-provided housing for self-employment, Social Security purposes is solely the responsibility of the minister. The church is not responsible to set the fair rental value. Number 6, the housing exclusion and retired ministers. Distributions from a denominationally sponsored 403B or 401k plan have generally been designated as a housing allowance. Retired ministers may also exclude the rental value of a home furnished by a church or a rental allowance paid by a church as compensation for past services. As we mentioned getting started, we have often called the housing exclusion a minister's best friend for tax purposes. As we've walked through these key points together, I'm sure you can now see why that's true.